Hi there, folks. Saber4 here. Going to talk a little bit today about the FFG live stream and where we are just in the meta going forward. We had the event just a few minutes ago, which had a concession to the current meta that we've seen and that we've talked about in the first couple of weeks, which would be the suspension of a couple of cards, and we're going to take a look at kind of what's there. So in this little bit, what we're going to get, we're going to get the results of that live stream, talk about the suspension list, the impact on the meta. We'll talk about kind of why that happens and the pillars of this type of game, the pivot that's here and the problem that exists when you create games and sets and have to play test way out in advance. We'll look at contenders for the reset, and I'm going to give you a teaser deck for an upcoming video for this week. All right, so I imagine most of you probably watched the FFG live stream and know already that there was going to be a suspension. We didn't know to what extent prior to, but most people kind of suspected that it was going to be the 3 cards that we got. They did discuss that the protocol of Fantasy Flight in Star Wars Unlimited has been to address problematic meta with the smallest adjustments that are possible. In the set 3 meta, there was discussion of DJ and the interaction that he specifically had with Han and kind of how things were playing out. DJ wound up on the suspended list this time, mainly because it created a unfair game and a negative play experience with the Han decks, and created something that was really not intended, with the ability to steal and destroy a resource, thus permanently ramping the Han player and permanently deramping the player who got a resource pulled from them. So effective Friday, 4/11, DJ will go into suspension, as will Jango Fett, which we expected. That's going to pull a deck from the list that was 20% of the overall meta, that was converting at a very high rate, and just was sort of problematic for tournament play. And then we also pulled Triple Dark Raid. And that one was one that the explanation behind it had to do more with the idea that when you design Triple Dark Raid, it was a little bit less space heavy of a set. And in some of the elements of what you were doing, you were also using Boba Fett, because Boba Fett had not been suspended internally when they were designing the set. And so using Triple Dark Raid came with the inherent risk of whiffing, came with the inherent risk that you were going to draw 7 cards, not find a vehicle, and that you would have spent 3 resources for essentially nothing. Now with the current Jump to Lightspeed set and the amount of ships and vehicles that we have in here that have such a nice powerful impact in the game, Triple Dark Raid being a search card that also managed to give a discount to the unit that it brought in and then returned it to your hand, so that damaging the thing just really didn't do any good, unless you could outright defeat it. But then you were burning your own hand to a crisp, trying to get after something that was going to go back to hand anyway. And so it made for a kind of unfair set and advantage out of Triple Dark Raid. Jango, as we know, the problem with him was that ability, when combined with some of the very powerful effects of things like War Juggernaut, IG-2000, and Devastator, to exhaust an entire board. And that put him in a situation where even getting to Jango to get rid of him became difficult and really shut games down outside of playing mirror matches. As we said, Jango was expected. The meta snapshot that we put up early this week suggested that even in a very large data set, we had 1,850 decks put in, and he was 20% of them. His play rate was triple that of any other leader. His conversion rate, the rate at which that particular deck makes it to a top cut or top table, was twice his play rate. So it was 40% plus in final tables. So not unexpected at all. So we're going to look at a couple things that have to do with just how this type of game works in general. And I've divided this up and I've called it the pillars, the pivot, and the problem. The well-established pillars of this type of game and for really any type of card game where you're constructing decks on your own, are aggressive decks, which are small unit, fast, pushing damage quickly. They're generally strong against control, generally weak to mid-range. Mid-range decks, which are adaptable, they play on curve. They continue escalating a threat as the game goes on, because as you get bigger and bigger down their curve, they are more and more powerful. They can control the board against an aggressive deck because their units keep getting powerful and the aggressive deck stays small, but they're weak to control. And then control prefers that small board, but they also do things like to create card advantage and come out with very big late game threats, and are generally stronger against mid range but weak to aggressive. In Star Wars, we've seen a couple of things that come out, and these are familiar secondary archetypes to other games as well, but combo decks, which look to take advantage of synergy and or combination within decks. And a lot of things that we have with this in this game are things that are tribal. So Cad Bane, tribal with Underworld, Grand Moff Tarkin, tribal with Imperial, and Leia, tribal with Rebel. Have that at their core, but they may function within some of the other pillars that already exist. And then tempo. And tempo looks to control the flow of game. It looks to either condense its own actions and so stay at a advantageous position with initiative, or to create pressure by limiting the actions that your opponent can take. And your opponent might wind up with initiative, but they wind up with initiative because they had nothing else to do. And it allows even your smaller units to kind of chip away. The Gar Saxon deck that I presented earlier this week has an example of this, and I will link that video in the description of this one. So the pivot, the balance point. The balance point is keeping those games short and meaningful and able to be played very quickly, while allowing all three archetypes and their various subtypes to persist. The health of a meta really depends on a paper, rock, scissors interaction. And when FFG talked about the creation of this game, they wanted to have pretty short games. If you go back and look at some of their early articles, the initial base health, the common bases, were 25. And we now have that on the rare bases, which is our kind of starting point for things like ECL Tarkentown. But the initial start point was 25 as a common base, and then less for those, because the games were intended to last 15 minutes. And so your best of three can burn through in 45 plus your sideboard pretty easily. But they evolve over time, and a leader just internally to a cycle can move between archetypes. And we've seen that. So Sabine was by far the best of the aggressive decks, bar none, in the first three sets. Except that as those sets progressed, Sabine became more and more of a mid-range deck. Now, that sounds really strange. She was still aggressive. She's still the best aggressive. Look at her progress. Orderly progress in Sabine. You put out a 2-cost unit, something like Battlefield Marine. You put out a 3-cost unit. You built to a 4. You might have put 2 things down at 4, but that's your Sabine flip turn. And you might have played a couple of things in that round to get that big push on Sabine's turn. But then 5 and 6 are Poe and Wrecker. And you're going on curve with this as you're doing things that you really want to do. And so, Sabine has become a little bit more of a mid-range deck than what she started with. The thing that you have when you talk about meta, and when I look at numbers and kind of go through and analyze how this all plays out, is that competitive players gravitate toward best ofs. They'll find an archetype, they'll find the things that are there, they'll play that archetype, but then they'll move and shift towards, very centrally, towards the decks that are the best at the particular thing that they're trying to do. And so inclusion of those other 2 subtypes, we still need to have, if you've ever watched Big Bang Theory, we still need to have this idea of paper, rock, scissors, lizard, Spock. We want all of them to be able to interact with the others, Have some weaknesses here and there back and forth, have some strengths back and forth, but be able to play fairly across a wide field. The problem comes in when one deck within an archetype when one deck can deal with its archetype mirrors efficiently. And Jango could do that. Jango could play mid-range with any of the other mid-range decks and just absolutely mop the floor with them. And when it does that, that's a best of. Now, when it beats the pillar that it's supposed to, plays fairly into its own, and doesn't really suffer when playing against the third archetype that it should be weak to, that's a best of deck. And that's what we saw with Jango. That's what we saw with Boba Fett before his suspension. And so this is why he winds up on the suspended list. DJ created a same thing. He had a interaction that was just a complete negative experience. Even though telegraphed, especially when you talk about tech, DJ himself was enough of a threat that somebody playing against Han would have to hold back resources over and over again to deal with DJ if he was put on the table, and try to do so in a way that didn't just get pecked to death by Han. But Han is problematic with that because he's playing over rate. He's allowed to resource cheat. And in doing so, my threes are having to stop your fours, and DJ is going to come down and cut me down a resource as well. So it's really problematic to have that kind of card. It was discussed at the end of set 3, now being suspended here at the beginning part of set 4. Similarly, as we said with Triple Dark Raid, in the lists of Jango, 100% had Triple Dark Raid as a 3 of. In a world where Boba Fett was still a part of the playtesting, that might not have been as big of a problem. But in a world where Boba was suspended, which is what we have, and Jango, with the ability that Triple Dark Raid has, was far too much. This is all carefully guided. This is all data driven. Moves to restrict cards are part of really the long term health of a game. I'm never one who's happy to see cards suspended, but we have to acknowledge that is a part of how this works and kind of move on from it. Take a look if you want. The data for these is in the set 2 or in the week 2 recap. What are the contenders after reset? What are we pivoting to? Well, Quinlan Voss and Tarkentown is going to be a really strong competitor. If you look at the data, I use the Star Wars Unlimited competitive hub, and I've started to watch a lot the table that's there of kind of all of these leaders put together. Ian 7036 on Discord, fantastic job of putting together a spreadsheet that really encapsulates how this works. And Quinlan Tarkentown had a green rate with only a few red outliers. And so he is going out there and playing into a wide field as well or better than anything else outside of Jango. And really the couple of outliers aren't even meta staples. Bossk is more common with blue. Sabine is more common with ECL. And those two were the only outliers. Sabine ECL is fair into Quinlan, but more volatile in her other matchups. She is at her best, though, in some of those matchups where Quinlan is at his weakest. And so when you look at those matchups of Sabine ECL versus Sabine Yellow, ECL is winning. When you look at her against Bossk Green, Sabine ECL is winning. Boba Yellow has not really fared as well, and I'm interested to see. I haven't had time to play and build without Triple Dark Raid in that, because I do think that was a very high functioning part of that deck. But Boba Yellow has not fared terribly well into anything as far as Quinlan, Sabine, or Han 1 Yellow. but it does play fairly into slightly red against like Cad Bane and Piet. Han 1 yellow will change significantly with the loss of DJ, because without that threat, he's maybe not quite the same as he was. He's still difficult to deal with. He's still playing above rate and has the ability to have that massive 5 to 7 jump, which really is hard to deal with for many decks. But he is an equal struggle into Quinlan as he is successful into Sabine. Um, the people who are playing Han, or the people who came off of him to play Jango, are pretty well established with how that play line works, and I think that that's going to be one that people find some success with because of its familiarity. Uh, I think when they were talking earlier about one of the leaders that they expected to do better but has not, Piet has not had the success in really any color combination. And what's interesting is that without triple dark raid, Piet yellow kind of falls apart. And so this suspension also removed, in my opinion, one of the really possible color patterns, because Piet, yes, yellow has some other strong cards that are in there. You've got some tempo play, you've got electromagnetic pulse, you've got access to a ship or two with ambush, but the ability and the threat of triple dark raid to be able, especially on Piet's flip, to make a huge jump just isn't there. And without that deck is not as powerful or as favorable to me as blue or red. Because of the volume of Jango games, all of these had significantly less data. When you look at some of the matchups that Jango had, there were literally hundreds of data points already. And some of these are looking at less than 40. But they're still useful for percentages to kind of understand what's going on. But I would suggest, if you're ever interested in it, to go and check out those data tables. They are extremely well done. We're going to end up here with a deck that's a preview of some of the things that we're going to be doing this week. I wanted to take a look here at Bossk Blue, the Liverpool winner. This was by Ali G over there in England, and big props to somebody who made this, because this is a tricky deck to play. I have played Bossk Blue, but I did not do so with nearly as few units. And here he managed to do this as a main board configuration with 4 units total, aside from his leader. And so this is a hard control deck with the ability to do restock, the ability to heal itself a little bit, but to really work to eliminate your opponent's plays. You got 5 copies in here effectively of Power of the Dark Side if you don't have anything on the table, where you're able to put down and force your opponent to remove a non-leader unit, or a leader unit in the case of Power of the Dark Side if it's their only option. Top target is a nice bounty to be able to put on something. If you can ever double claim that with Bossk, it's hard to get. It's really hard to get past. Same thing with Deathmark. If you have the ability to draw that many cards, you draw 4 cards with Bossk once. With this much removal out there and available to him, that card advantage is going to be very difficult to recover from. You have Rival's Fall. You have No Glory Only Results. The ability to really target and take out mainline units, and then if you ever needed the reset, Super Laser Blast there to clear the whole board. Emperor Palpatine, as well as Supreme Leader Snoke. With the exception of the client, who comes in at 3, you have a long way to get to your first other unit that's not your leader. And so you had a long path to get all the way down to having Snoke or Palpatine on the table. And then, of course, it finishes out with the very strong combination of having Snoke and Avenger together. And that's been a hard one to deal with if a control deck can ever get there. And clearly this did, and did so very well, because it won a sector qualifier. We'll talk a little bit more about this, as well as some of the Bossk decks, later in the week. But just wanted to give you that recap and a little bit of thoughts on the suspension of Jango, DJ, and Triple Dark Raid. Let me know in the comments what you think, and we will see you guys later on.